Hi everyone. Some of you will remember a few weeks ago I produced a video identifying those shortwave portables that I've used that I consider to be amongst the best ever. And that felt like the right thing to do because I own a lot of radios, but I've also sold a lot of radios and bought a lot of radios. So some pass through the shack and then leave again, others are keepers. And when you've owned and used as many radios as I have, I felt that put me in a reasonable position to kind of make that judgment. And some of you will also remember that the 6 that I identified as the best radios that I've used, particularly for shortwave, based on different criteria, were the Eton E1, the Sony ICF2001D, based on ultimate performance, and very close the ICF SW55 by Sony, and then some more modern radios, the Eton Satellite Grundig edition, the Texan PL880 and the X8 Data DH08, which is right up there, even without the quality, potentially, build quality, but just an absolute performance. And then on miniaturization, the Sony ICF SW100. So they were the 6 best that I identified as being right up there with the best of all time. Obviously, there are a lot that didn't make the grade, and I mentioned that on the next video I was going to cover those radios that didn't make the cut. And there are 4 of them. There are probably more than 4. Perhaps I'll do another video, but the 4 that I identified, the Sanjin ATS909X2, the Texan the Texan H501X, the original Belka DX, and the Sony ICF SW55. Now there are 2 criteria here that separate 2 of these radios from the other 2, and there are those that should have made the grade and those that could have. And starting with those that should have made the grade is the Texan H501X, which, at least in regard to my own particular example, has been a major disappointment. The 909X2 is also disappointing in 1 or 2 particular aspects. And then there's the Belka DX original version and the Sony ICF SW55, which could have made it if they'd been designed, or elements of the design have been slightly different. So I think there's 2 positives and 2 negatives, if you think of it that way. There are 2 radios that really should be better than they are, and there are 2 radios that could have been if the design parameters had been a bit different. So I'm going to go through those one by one, explain my points of view, reminding everybody that it's my own personal opinion based on my having used these radios at length, and then I'll come to some sort of conclusion, I'm sure. So let's start with the H501X. Hi everyone. So the first shortwave portable on my list of those that either should or could have made it to become part of a group of what I consider to be the best ever is the Texan H501X. I wasn't going to buy this radio originally. I was actually going to buy the new Eton Elite Satellite, which was the re-engineered Eton E1. Waited a long time for that radio to eventually materialise, and when it did, the first production run was horrendous, just a litany of hardware problems, software problems, quality control problems. So I gave up on that and I bought this radio instead. Obviously it's cheaper, but £330 what I paid for it. It's a lot of money to pay for a shortwave portable. Hoping that the performance was going to be a step up from the PL880. Great radio, which as you know I've been using for many years, and unfortunately it's turned out to be a complete waste of money. I like the industrial design of it. It's very sort of Grundig satellite, 1980s, 1990s era with the recessed controls, etc. The fact that it's got dual speakers, it's a bit different. But other than that, there's not much positive to offer, unfortunately. I don't know whether it's my example, but mine lacks sensitivity on medium wave. I never copied any transatlantic DX on this rig, and I don't know whether it's because it's a lack of sensitivity or selectivity or a combination of both. But when VOCM in Newfoundland and Labrador in Canada is booming on 590 kilohertz on any other rig, plug one of my Wellbrooks into this and on upper sideband to reject the Spanish station just couple of kilohertz down, you can't hear anything. So, which was really disappointing. It's an absolute disaster on medium wave for me. The audio bandwidth options, the maximum on shortwave is 6 kilohertz, which is probably okay. You get 9 kilohertz on AM. I know some people think can't understand why you can't have 9 on both. There are some big signals on shortwave, CRI, etc., RRI. That's not a big issue for me particularly. The synchronous detection circuit is almost the disaster that people would have you believe. When you engage it, all it really does is it locks onto the signal, and then when you get QS Baker, it just changes the pitch of the AF of the audio, and then if you get very deep fading, it just distorts the audio, and it's worse. The clarity is worse than without it. So, synchronous detection circuit doesn't work in the same way that you'd expect it to on a Sony 2001D or an SW77 or the 7600G or the SW100, all radios that I own. Brilliant. But synchronous detection on this radio doesn't work. Not surprised about that. I don't hold that against it so much because that's just the way it is with modern shortwave portables based on DSP, but still disappointing. And the other issue is the battery life. The battery consumption is horrendous. It comes with 2 rechargeable 3.7 volt 18650 rechargeable batteries, 2600 milliamp hour. There's a switch on the back, so you basically power the rig from one battery, and when that runs out, you can switch over to the other battery. It's a nice touch, but I'll be honest with you, if you put this radio on in the garden with any sort of volume and you've got it fully charged, the full charge indicator loses the first notch within minutes. So it really doesn't last very long running it on batteries. It would have been far better, I think, in my personal opinion, if this radio ran on AAs. Put some Duracells into it. You just can't rely. You charge both batteries up, take it out with you. You're sort of concerned. Well, how long am I going to listen to this radio for? Because you only get a few hours, if that. Obviously, it's proportional to how loud you have the volume. So if you've got it in the garden, you turn the volume up a bit. The battery life consumption's worse, and therefore the battery life's worse. So that's also a big issue for me. So overall, you've got an expensive radio, £330. No good for medium wave DXing. The synchronous detection doesn't work very well. The sideband audio, I find it what I call muddy. It's not really a fair test because I'm only indoors with the telescopic, but I don't like the sideband audio, even with a lot of treble. It's just very with a slightly wider bandwidth. It just always sounds a bit muddy to me. It's lacking some sort of higher end AF frequencies across the range on sideband. So overall, it's not a radio that I particularly fell in love with. I'll be honest with you. Right now I kind of wish I'd never bought it. Really, should have had the potential. If it had been an incremental improvement on the PL880, then it should be up there with some of the best shortwave portables that have ever been made. But unfortunately, it hasn't made the grade. The overall performance is worse than my PL880, and therefore it should have been good. But at least my example, it pains me to say it, but it's nowhere near. So that's my honest opinion on the Texan H501X, and that's the reason why there's only probably 4 or 5, 6 videos on the channel using it, because it just doesn't perform, unfortunately. So there you go. Hi everyone. So the second radio on my list of those that didn't make the cut to be considered one of the best ever is the Sanjin ATS909X2. I got this radio at Christmas time. They cost £225, which cheaper than a Texan H501X, but still quite a lot of money to pay for a shortwave portable. I've always loved the aesthetics of the 909 line. So when the 909X, the original model, was introduced onto the market, oh my goodness me, probably 10 years ago now, can't remember. I remember thinking at the time, what a beautiful looking radio. A lot of people think that. It looks superb. The X2 is obviously very similar in that respect. And I've always liked the idea of the AM RF gain pot, which is very useful, although it's not very obvious. And I can remember using this radio and having the RF gain turned down because I'd been listening to a station and turn it down to stop it overloading, and then you pick it up and do some DX and you forget. So it's a beautiful looking radio. The original model was a bit deaf on the antenna, on the built-in telescopic. I think to a certain extent that issue's been resolved. My problems with this radio, and some of you will have seen this, is that the audio level on sideband is absolutely horrendous. It's so low you can hardly hear it. This is the RAF military Volmet signal, which is actually quite close to me, and that's maximum volume. It's for using this radio outdoors, listening to sideband, unless you're using a large antenna. I don't know why the Sanjin engineers thought it was acceptable, but the sideband audio is so low, it's basically it's unusable, basically, and as a result, I rarely use it for listening to signals where you need to demodulate it with sideband. It's as simple as that. Otherwise, I like it as a radio for listening to broadcast stations. It's not the most sensitive portable that I own, so if I'm doing DXing, I don't gravitate towards it. It's just it's a nice radio to use, and the audio is quite good. But for any type of DXing work, and that's obviously a very important criteria when you're considering, what is the group of portables that represent, the best receivers, for shortwave that are ever made. And if you can't really incorporate the use of sideband into your thinking, then it's a non-starter, which unfortunately this radio is. If the sideband worked properly in terms of audio level, AF level, and if that worked, and if this radio had synchronous detection and that worked, it would be up there. You'd have to include it, but I can't because of that reason. I'd be quite happy to spend a bit more money on this radio if those elements were okay, but they're simply not. So despite the fact that it's a lovely looking radio, and it's a pleasure to use, there's no way that it can be included in my list of the best ever. So unfortunately, on that basis, it misses out. It'll be interesting to see whether in the future Sanjin introduce an X3, or whether they introduce some kind of firmware upgrade. I don't know whether that's possible to improve the audio on sideband. It's interesting actually, because there's a similar issue with my ICF SW55, my vintage Sony, but I'll come on to that on the next video. So there you go. Although aesthetically one of the best looking radios, portable radios ever manufactured, it just doesn't, for me, make the grade with its poor AF levels on sideband. So on to the next. Hi everyone. So the next receiver on my list of those that either could have or should have made the cut to be considered one of the best ever is the original Belka DX. I've got nothing bad to say about this radio for what it cost, given that it was designed and manufactured in low quantities compared to, you know, Sony, global sort of multinational conglomerate that designed and built a number of small shortwave receivers, not as small as this, mind you, but you know, the ICF SW07, the SW100, the original SW1. It's a fantastic receiver, and it's not that it should have made the grade or could have made the grade. It basically didn't, because of two factors really. One is that the original version started at 1.5 megahertz, so basically you missed most of the medium wave band, all of long wave, etc., and only but you got all the short wave up to 30 megahertz. And you know, I kind of get that. Why, you know, I get why they did that, etc. But if you're going to be, or if your product is going to be considered one of the best portables ever, for me at least, you know, it needs to include all of AM broadcast bands really. So that's one reason for me. The other reason is the ergonomics, because obviously it's so small, it would have been impossible or very, very difficult to include a full array of buttons, etc., and controls to use this radio, and I get that. So you have to kind of like scroll through various menus, etc., to change the demodulation, even change the volume, and that's fine. But for me, I find that a pain. It's okay if I'm tuning into a single station and I'm listening to it, but then that doesn't happen very often because I'm going to do that on a larger radio with better audio. But it does become a drag, and that's, like I said, I'm okay with it because the Belka DX is a fantastic radio. The performance of this radio in terms of sensitivity and selectivity is just about as good as anything I own. I recorded some really exotic tropical band DX on shortwave, you know, Radio Club de Para from Brazil, Radio Tama from Peru, other exotic stuff. It's a fantastic receiver, but those are the two issues that I have with it. I think there's a new, the new version now includes the lower broadcast bands, and also I think has an IQ output, so you can actually use it with a pan adapter and actually look at a display, spectrum display, which is fantastic. But for me, the ergonomics, because I don't use it every day, I come to use it and sometimes I've actually forgotten how to switch the bloody thing on or to do something, because you know, it's not intuitive. You have to learn how to use it. I'm not saying it's really difficult, but if it's a receiver that you kind of dip in and out of every now and then, you have to kind of remember where everything is. And if you use it a lot, then having to constantly scroll through menus or click the volume button just to adjust the volume, the sensitivity, for me, it's just not quite as easy to use as other portables. And it's that, and the fact that it doesn't have the long wave and medium wave band coverage means it doesn't quite make the grade. I'm sure I'd have a different opinion with the upgraded version. You know, then you've only really got the ergonomics to deal with. Maybe I'd have a different opinion, but with this one, it doesn't quite make it. But it's not that it should have, but didn't. It just doesn't because of how it was designed. I love it. I'm going to record some more videos using it. It's a very popular radio, but for those two reasons doesn't quite make the final cut for one of the best ever. So there you go. Some of you may agree with that, some of you will disagree, I'm sure, but just my personal opinion. Okay, so and then on to the last one. Hi everyone. So the last radio in my list of those that either could or should have made the cut to be considered one of the best ever is the Sony ICF SW55, and because it didn't make the cut, don't take that as I'm of the opinion that it's not a great receiver, because it is. Obviously its bigger brother or sister, the SW77, did make the cut. The 55 is similar in certain respects. It's smaller, it doesn't have synchronous detection, it has this kind of internal speaker with a kind of sort of post box shaped grill at the front, so the sound is kind of generated inside and passes through. So it's a very clever design. In terms of sensitivity, on some bands it's reported to be as sensitive as the SW57, which I think I can concur with. It was once described, I think, by the Medium Wave Circle as similar in performance to the Sony ICF SW5600G, which I also get. Why doesn't it make the grade? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is that it's got wide and narrow audio bandwidth filters, and on the narrow filter the audio is quite low. Not as bad as the Sanjin ATS909X2, but the audio is quite low on the low audio filter option. It's also low on sideband, again not as bad as the Sanjin. So those are two issues that didn't really bother me greatly, but I was aware of them. And I don't understand why Sony didn't fit this radio with synchronous detection, because they fitted it to the 7600G, which costs less. I think you would consider this to be a higher end radio at the time. It costs more. And I just don't get why it didn't have that. If this radio had sync, then I think you'd have to consider it to be one of the best portables of all time, because it was so similar to the 77 in performance, in a much smaller form factor. Actually, this is about as close. I consider this a pocket-sized radio. Of course, it won't fit in a pocket. It's bigger than the 7600G, but it's still of a size where you would consider it easily portable, whereas the 77 is quite a big radio, more akin to the size of a tabletop, just runs on batteries. So they're my only two issues with this. I took this photograph. This is my radio, which I don't have at the moment because it's away being repaired. It's having the capacitors replaced. Well, that's now been done because they've either dried up or leaked or both. And there's a warble on the sideband AF, which is now being looked at. So if this radio wasn't as good as I think it is, or at least as good as I'm saying, I wouldn't have bothered to pay to get it repaired. And so, but I've done that. I am getting it repaired because this is one of my favourite receivers. I don't want to be able to use it in the future. So, you know, those are really the two issues that I have with it. I wish it had synchronous detection, and the audio on narrow AM and sideband is a bit low. Other than that, it's brilliant. If you can get hold of one of these on eBay or wherever, don't hesitate, it's fantastic. But if you are buying one, check whether the caps have been replaced or not, and if they haven't, then you need to mentally add another 150-200 quid to your budget, because that's kind of what it costs to get that done. But in terms of performance, brilliant radio to use. Just didn't quite make the cut because of those two issues. So that's my opinion on it, and yeah, I'd be interested to know what your views are. So that's the Sony ICF SW55, almost but not quite. So there you have it, my 4 receivers that didn't make the cut to be on my list of the best ever, for good and bad reasons really. Ultimately it's subjective to a certain extent. You can't just go on absolute performance. There's no such thing as a perfect radio. These 4 aren't perfect, and I'm not saying that they're all bad either. They all have their good points, but those have been repeated many times, probably by me and obviously by many others on the internet. Yeah, there are 2 that really could have made it if they just thought about the design a little bit more. And there are 2 that really have no reason not to be, particularly if you consider the price. So I still use these radios, not particularly for DXing necessarily. A couple of them, the Sanjin and the Texan in particular. The Belka DX is still brilliant, and the Sony ICF SW55, still brilliant radio. Just don't quite have the all-round capability and ease of use, ergonomics, etc. that the very best do. So yeah, that's my view on it. Thank you very much for watching. I hope it was interesting, hopefully enjoyable, and if I consider some of the other portables in my collection, perhaps I'll do another video at some point. But for now, that's it. Thanks very much, and 73.
Valid from the 17th at 1200 until the 18th at 1800. Wind 230 degrees, 15 knots. Visibility 10 kilometers or more. Cloud few at 1,200 feet. Spotted at 2,500 feet. Tempo from 1200 until 2100. Visibility 8 kilometers. Moderate rain showers. Cloud ceiling broken at 1,200 feet. Few cumulonimbus at 3,000 feet. Probability 40%. Tempo from 1200 until 1500. Wind 240 degrees, 17 knots. Gusting 27 knots. Becoming between 1500 and 18.